the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. The voice of the actor has entertained people throughout the ages. This man, Frederick Matthias Alexander, was developing a promising acting career when severe voice and breathing problems interrupted his progress. No medical treatment helped. Alexander solved his problems in such a way that his life's path led him in a new direction, to teach others his discoveries, known today as the Alexander Technique. Who was Alexander? What is his story? Where did he come from?
I wonder whether you've heard of the Alexander Technique. It popped up in our discussion on acting schools the other night, so we thought we'd explore it further tonight. The Alexander Technique is a way of learning how to rid your body of harmful tension, or more accurately, a way to unlearn bad habits that have developed over time. It's a method of rediscovering your natural balance and posture by thinking in activity. It's widely studied by actors and musicians and performers, but it applies to all of us, really. Who doesn't hold tension in their neck and shoulders? Who doesn't yearn for better posture? In fact, there are thousands of Alexander Technique teachers across Europe and America, although relatively few in Australia. And that's odd, because this is where it all began. The creator of the Alexander Technique is an Australian, Frederick Matthias Alexander, who developed his work in the 1890s in Melbourne. His thinking's been so influential that he was featured as one of 200 people in the 1988 bicentenary book, The People Who Made Australia Great. Yet, I guess few of us would know much about him. But one person who does is Rosslyn McLeod, and she joins us now. Roslyn's an Alexander Technique teacher of many years, and she joins us from her home in Adelaide. Rosslyn, good evening. Welcome to Nightlife.
Thank you, Philip. I'm pleased to be here.
So Alexander himself was an Australian. Where? Tell us a bit about him.
Well, it's a fascinating story. His grandfather grew up in England, in Wiltshire, and he was a village craftsman. But this was around the 1830s. And at that time, a lot of the farm labourers were being thrown off the land because of the new threshing machines. So the farm labourers were rioting, and Matthias Alexander, as a village craftsman, was sympathetic. So he took part too. And for that, he was transported to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years.
Ah, so he shares my family's heritage. We're convicts in Tasmania.
That's it.
He was a bit evasive about his ancestry, wasn't he? He sort of claimed Scottish descent and wanted to upgrade the status of his forebears later on. But then again, he was living at a time, I suppose, when the convict stain was a negative, not these days, something to boast about.
Yeah, well, you see, Matthias, once he got his ticket of leave in the mid-1830s, moved up to the northwest coast of Tasmania around Wynyard, and he settled there and had large family. And then his son John married and had a family, and their first son was Frederick Matthias Alexander, born in 1869 in Wynyard.
Okay.
And then the young F.M. Alexander, he didn't have a lot of schooling because apparently he was very bright and asked so many questions that the teacher said, look, to the parents, let your sons roam around the countryside and I'll give him private tuition. And that's what happened. And this teacher instilled in Alexander a love of poetry and Shakespeare.
So that's right. It's fascinating, really, because given, as you say, where he came from, he moves to Melbourne as a young man to pursue acting and professional reciting, which was, of course, a thing at the time. How much do we know about this time of his life?
Well, before he moved, he actually went south of Wynyard to Waratah. The Mount Bischoff tin mine had just opened. It became the richest tin mine in the world, and Alexander was a junior accountant for 3 years. So he was able to save some money, but also all around Australia then they were setting up mechanics institutes, and these were the centre of towns with libraries and stage work for drama. And so Alexander took part in these drama activities in Waratah, but by the time he was 20, yes, he just wanted to be an actor, moved to Melbourne at the beginning of the 1890s, and of course in Melbourne then gold was king, and it was just a wonderful place to be, and there were big theatres and international visitors like Sarah Bernhardt, and it must have been so exciting for a young would-be actor to be able to witness all this and then start his own acting lessons.
Yes, he began he began to suffer from hoarseness, and at times after performing he could hardly speak. So friends noticed he'd been gasping during his recitations. So he began a process of self-examination, didn't he, with mirrors into his speaking habits to see if he could find out why.
Yes, he had to do something, because either the voice problems were going to mean he wasn't going to have his acting career, but there was a big question he asked himself. Why is it when I'm talking to my friends I don't have the voice problems, but up on stage I do? So he knew he didn't have a structural fault in the throat, etc. So that's what made him think, well, I've got to find out what am I doing when I recite. And that's why he got the mirrors, and he recited and looked in the mirror. Then he spoke as though talking to his friends, and he alternated the two activities. And one of the reasons he was so good at observation, I think, is because when you grew up in Wynyard in the 1870s and 80s, you travelled around by horse. And Alexander's father was a blacksmith, and he developed a really good eye for the gait of a horse. You learn to observe. And so when he had to stand in front of the mirrors and observe himself, after a while, he picked up that he was doing extra things, particularly with how the head sits on top of the spine. And he realised that putting these extra tensions round the neck and in the shoulders, that's what he did not do when he just spoke to his friends. So the challenge was, how can I use my voice and breathing just like I do when I talk to friends? But that's habit. And that's where it took him quite a while to realise that as soon as he thought of reciting, it was important then not to put the extra effort into his body. And so that's where he learnt to stop and say no to the old habit and just decide that he wanted his neck to be free and a nice head balance. And then he found, after changing his habits over several months, he developed fine voice resonance and remarkable breath control, could have gone on with the acting career, except that in those days, no microphones, a lot of people learned elocution. And if you were a lawyer or a politician, you took voice lessons. So a lot of people then wanted to learn from Alexander, how have you made such an improvement? And so he had a big clientele of elocution pupils.
Yes. So describe in essence to me what the Alexander technique is then.
Well, it's learning to do things differently. It's knowing that there's choice. And of course, when little children, if we look at small children, they move very well. There's a coordination, the head balances beautifully on top of the spine. But as we grow, we start to develop extra tensions and harmful habits. And the only way to change them is to first of all realise what the harmful thing is, to stop that, and to then use the muscles differently with different balance and less effort.
So that you obtain a natural speaking style that you would normally use when you're trying to perform.
Yes, and it's not only with performance. I mean, probably one of the really examples we're all familiar with nowadays is the use of the iPhone. And you watch people, even younger people, bend to look at their iPhone, and they are bending from the bottom of the neck, which means not only the head but the neck is put well forward. And if you put the head and the neck forward, you start to interfere with your breathing and you get a bit squashed in the whole of the rest of the torso. Whereas there's no hinge at the bottom of the neck. The hinge where the head sits on top of the spine is roughly between the ears. And what we have to do is to stop making a false hinge at the bottom of the neck, and learned to bend and use the head as it was meant to swivel on the true top of the spine.
Yes, that's right. It might sound obvious in a way, although he was well ahead of his time, wasn't he? Because science is still trying to catch up to explain how this works, but there's a lot of evidence-based research which seems to support what he was doing, isn't there?
Yes, well, you see, nowadays we've got much more equipment to measure all sorts of things, and people understand more now about the neuroplasticity of the brain. And a few years ago in England, there was a Professor Paul Little, head of preventative medicine at Southampton University. He had a big team and they researched back pain and the Alexander technique. They had a grant of £600,000 from the British Medical Council, so it was pretty extensive. And they only took people with chronic back pain. And the lucky group that had 24 Alexander lessons, so given knowledge of how to do daily activities with less strain. Over the years, when at the end of the project, instead of 21 days of back pain per month, it was down to 3 days of back pain per month. And the next group that were given 6 Alexander lessons, so not as much knowledge, they had about 12 days. And the ones that still just did exercise and perhaps injections, there wasn't a lot of change in the number of back pain days that they had. So the Alexander work, it gives people knowledge of how to look after themselves better.
I'm speaking with Rosslyn McLeod, who's an Alexander technique teacher. You may have heard of the Alexander technique, maybe not, but it's widely practiced, particularly by actors and others, and it has many firm adherents. Dame Judi Dench, John Cleese, cricketer Greg Chappell are amongst the millions of people who swear by the technique. When we talk about technique, Rosslyn, here, what FM Alexander developed was a series of body drills, was it, to improve? What is it?
No, we don't give people exercises. Once FM, as he's known, Frederick Matthias, went to England in 1904, he went armed with excellent references from medical people in Australia, people who had contacts in London. So when he arrived, yes, prominent actors had lessons, but over a period of time, over the years, 50 years he taught in England and America, there were people like George Bernard Shaw, Sir Stafford Cripps, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in Churchill's wartime cabinet. He had a lot of support, but when he had first started sharing his knowledge in the 1890s in Melbourne, he had used mainly words. But the problem is, if you say something to someone else, like leave your neck free, people will try to do something. And so what Alexander found, that if he used his hands, now when I say used the hands, it's not massage, it's not manipulation. What he would do would put his hands gently on the back of the neck or the head of the person and guide them how to do an activity. So one that we look at a lot is how people stand up and sit down, because certainly as people get older, they often have trouble doing this easily. So we would guide, if someone's sitting, you have a hand on the back of the head and the back, and you guide the person to move more smoothly and not to put sudden spurts of tensions into the body. So Alexander found that by using his hands, he could guide the person to do the movement differently. And so it's this use of the hands which seems to be fairly specific to the Alexander work in the way that we use our hands. We're not trying to make something happen. We are monitoring the muscle tension of the pupil from moment to moment. So the pupil has the experience of moving more easily. And once you get that practical experience, it's something then you can start to learn to use for yourself.
To practice for yourself. So that's right. He's most people assume he is British because he goes to London, doesn't he?
Yes.
And does he become well known in his life?
Oh, certainly in England and America, yes. But certainly there was what happened was Alexander left here in 1904, and a younger brother had also learnt to teach this work. He left in 1910 with the mother and a couple of other sisters. So there was no one in Australia for nearly 50 years to teach this work. But in the meantime, in England, in 1931, when Alexander was about 60 or just over that, 62, people were saying, we need teachers of your methods. He'd trained one or two or three people apprentice style, but the first formal teacher training course started in 1931. And from that, the Second World War interrupted things. But after that, once Alexander died in 1955, there were then sort of senior teachers to carry on and train teachers until now, as I say, there's thousands of teachers in Europe and America. But back here in Australia, there was one teacher came back in 1950, another one in 1960 to Melbourne, and it was early 1970s in Melbourne that I first came across it and started to have my Alexander lessons.
Yes, as I said when we were talking about professional acting schools the other day on the program, the Alexander technique came up then. It has very, very firm adherence, doesn't it? Particularly in the world of performance and acting and so on, and is still very much a part of the way acting is taught for many people, isn't it?
Yes, and certainly all the big colleges overseas, like Juilliard in New York and in England, the big music colleges in London, and also the Royal Northern Music College in Manchester, they all have Alexander teachers on their staffs, because whether you're a musician, an actor, it's no use waiting till you're out sort of trying to perform and then you don't give a good performance. It's crucial that you feel really good, ready to do a performance. So when you're learning your trade, as it were, to have these lessons as well in how to look after yourself and improve breathing and be freer in the moment is really important.
It's fascinating. And here we are, Frederick Matthias Alexander. He was born in Tasmania and grew up in Wynyard on the northwest coast of Tasmania. Who would have thunk, in a way? Rosslyn McLeod has been our guest. And by the way, Rosslyn, there's the World Congress, I understand, of the Alexander technique is going to be held at the end of August, I think, in Berlin, isn't it?
Yes, that's right, and there'll be hundreds of teachers. But the reason that I'm so interested in all this was when I lived in Melbourne and I was teaching at Melbourne University in the College of the Arts. I realised that almost 100 years earlier, in the 1890s, Alexander had started his work there, and there was no biography even when in the 1980s. So I started research in Melbourne. I found a lot of material. I did publish a book, Up from Down Under, which is about the Australian years of Alexander, and I really did it so that particularly people in Europe and America would realise where he'd come from. But I also then, took me many more years, I've made a documentary film, and this covers the whole of his life, how he developed his work, has modern-day material, has the interview with Professor Paul Little, a neuroscientist from the Albert Einstein Medical Centre in New York, and a practical Alexander lesson, an interview with James Galway, the great flautist who thinks the Alexander work is essential, and a lovely interview with 3 members of the King's College Choir, filmed in the Adelaide Town Hall when they were here on tour, because they all have Alexander lessons in Cambridge.
Fantastic. All right, it's been a great pleasure in getting you to recount the story, the life and times and the importance of the technique. Rosslyn McLeod, thank you for your time.
Thank you.